Hello everyone, Cintia here. I've adjusted my setup a little bit. Hopefully that can improve some of the image quality. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about building your religion. So this is going to be a pretty extensive topic. I'm not quite sure how it's going to end up playing out in terms of time length, but I may miss stuff. I've tried to be very thorough, but if I've missed something, this is just a lot to talk about. So the first important part of building your religion is actually figuring out what your religion's role is supposed to be within your setting. That's going to be really important for figuring out what you want your religion to do. So, given that, you're going to have to answer those questions. You're going to have to figure out how you want those things to work. I'm going to throw out some mechanical and narrative ideas as I go through. But let's kind of start at the first initial starting place, which is what's the object of worship? What is the religion sort of built around? Because there's something that's being built around, right? It's not just it may not necessarily be built around something. There is sort of an important category that doesn't necessarily have to have a supernatural or something being worshipped, which is kind of more of a philosophy or code. We'll talk about that when I get to categories. I've organized this in a whole outline to try to make sure I've covered everything. So anyway, if there is a worship aspect, and there typically will be, regardless of whether or not your religion was created with one, or your philosophy or code or whatever was created with one, there's typically going to be an object of worship. So let's go ahead and talk about various different things that end up being worshipped. So the first one, I think what most people are thinking about are supernatural entities. This could be things like gods or spirits or demons, whatever that means for your context, etc. What's really important here, there's a couple of different things to go over. First of all, is that there's probably a good argument that it should be polytheistic generally. There can be a misconception, I suppose, in today's world just because monotheistic religions have been very successful. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, the Abrahamic religions are all monotheistic, and they have been very successful. They have a lot of followers. And so that can present the idea that monotheism is kind of like a default way of handling religion. But if you look in terms of sheer number of religions, I think probably a majority of religions are actually polytheistic. So it's something really important to consider. There's a couple of advantages to polytheism in terms of creating a religion for a setting. And one of the big ones is you can decrease the power level of whatever is being worshipped. This can be really useful depending upon how you want to set stuff up. Other things that you can kind of get out of that can be rivalries between deities or things like that. And there's some really important stuff. So we all are probably familiar with the Greco-Roman style of deities, where they have some sort of domain of influence. So, for example, say you have Zeus, who's like king of the gods and stuff like that. But also you have a god of harvests and all that sort of stuff, right? This is a model, but another very common one that is actually discussed quite a bit in the Old Testament of the Bible, which is where I'm familiar with it mostly, is deities of peoples or land. So you'll have, for example, the god of such and such people group and a god of another such and such people group. And that god empowers them to be able to conquer other peoples, or if you go to somebody else's land, the god of that land, you're going to be worried about, okay, how am I making them happy so that way they ensure safe travel or things like that. So there's all sorts of stuff where you do see this idea of being concerned about the god of a land or spirits of various geographical features or things like that. If they're more malevolent in nature, then they typically get called demons or things like that. But there can be different languages. Demon comes from daemon, just a powerful entity. And keep in mind that you can have different tiers of supernatural entities. So you can have very powerful ones, then you can have lower ones. Maybe some are called gods, some are called spirits, and things like that. Think about some of that structure. This is some of the stuff about supernatural entities to consider. And then we have natural world stuff that might get worshipped. So this could be things like volcanoes, sun, moon, and stars are very common, rivers, potentially powerful animals. So perhaps your setting may have some incredibly powerful creatures that get worshipped as gods, as an example of this sort of thing. So think about, if you're going this route, what are the things that people are worshiping? Why? Keep in mind, you can have competition between things. You can have different religions. You can have different religious influences. Maybe you do have gods that people worship, but then they also worship natural features. It's a possibility. So you can always kind of blend some of this stuff together. But these are other categories of things that can be worshipped. There can be ways that people respond to that. And then, of course, there needs to be imaginary nothings. These are things that people believe to be something, like one of the other categories, usually supernatural entities, but they're just made up. There can be lots of different reasons why. Maybe people see the power of storms, and they believe that has to be the power of some deity, and then they create a deity to worship, and they say, oh, it's this, and there might be drugs involved in figuring these things out. Like, keep in mind, a lot of religious rituals and stuff like that could involve a lot of drug use. So that could be an important part of people coming up with some of this stuff. But this is an important thing to consider when you're building a religion. Is it actually worshiping a thing that exists? Or is it just made something up? Keep in mind that imaginary nothings are typically going to be accompanied by idols and other sorts of imagery like that. They're going to have made some sort of object that they're worshiping. This is just generally going to be true. We'll talk about that more later. And then another category that I think is overlooked a lot is the God King. So this is something that is very common. So there's a couple of different ways that this might play out. Typically, it's when the king is said to have divine lineage. It's basically them making them a demigod, but keep in mind that would put them on the same level as a god in people's eyes. So they were said to have supernatural powers, to be capable of doing things like, I don't know, making it rain or protecting people from their enemies. It's part of what would give a king religious power, but just secular power as well. If people believed that the king was a god, then they're a lot more likely to obey and follow that individual. It's important to consider what sort of powers they may have. Of course, in your setting, they may actually be a god or a demigod. Sometimes the king may be an actual god as well. It's important to kind of think about, how does your deity manifest? How does it interact with people? How does it relate with people? Especially if it's a real deity. What sort of interactions does it have? How involved is it? Is it subtly involved? Is it overtly involved? It's really important also to consider in any sort of willed being, so some sort of spirit or God king, what is this entity's motivations? And this is going to be really important as we kind of get into the remaining categories, but it's important to think about, what are their motivations? If they're an entity with will, which is important, we'll get to that in just a second, but if they're an entity with will, what do they want to accomplish? Why? What are the restrictions that they have to work with? What are the things that are kind of non-starters? For example, if you have some sort of deity that is perhaps rivals with another deity, how does that interact with things? Have they established any sort of treaties or truces or things like that, where they're like, well, we could intervene a lot, but if we started intervening, we'd kind of go nuclear on each other, and then we'd have nothing left to be competing over. Maybe that means that there's some sort of restriction where they have, like, we will fight through our followers, but we ourselves are going to not get too heavily involved, because if we do get involved, we're just going to destroy everything, and that doesn't serve in either of our purposes, right? You can have things like that. Stuff to think about. Another important category here is the power source. This is something that I'm terming, I don't know how much this is a real thing in terms of stuff that people actually worship or have worshipped in terms of real religions that have happened in the real world, but it is a natural conclusion of something that can be extremely useful for games. So the power source is basically a will-less source of power. That is, this is a thing, it's real, people can tap into it for power, but it doesn't have any sort of will. Now, granted, it may or may not be anthropomorphized in your setting if you have this sort of thing, and therefore people may not realize or consider its lack of will. So they might think of it as, for example, a supernatural entity of like, oh, if I do these things, I can tap into the power of so-and-so, and that allows me to be able to do this. but it may just be a power source. It doesn't really have a will or anything. It's just a thing that people can tap into. So if you're going this route, I would recommend considering having sort of elaborate ways of accessing this power. So the reason why is this can direct and guide behavior. It kind of turns it into a cosmic vending machine where you put in specific actions to get specific results. I mean, this is how a lot of people want religion to work anyway. They want it to where, oh, if I do these things, then I will get these results. And therefore, I'm going to do those things to get these results. And so if you have something that actually works that way, that's going to satisfy a lot of people's desire for what a deity is, quite frankly, and make work very well for your setting, especially if it's a simpler sort of setting with a lot of the religion. Keep in mind, this is just talking about what is being worshipped. And something that's really important to keep in mind here is that the truth of the situation, i.e., what you have decided it's going to actually be, and then what the people in your setting believe the situation is, may not necessarily have anything in common. So, for example, and I've kind of touched on this, but people could believe that they are worshiping a god, but they're really worshiping a demon or something from the natural world or even an imaginary nothing. Or it could be a power source, for example. So they could believe this is some sort of god, oh, this is the will of this god, all sorts of things, but it doesn't actually, there's nothing there, right? Or there's just a power source. There's no specific will. It's just you do these rituals, you get these things. It's kind of a form of magic. And speaking of power sources, I glossed over this one, but it could also be something that's very personal. For example, it could, in reality, be a person's own magical aptitude, their own magical potential, and perhaps a culture has mistaken magical potential for people being able to connect with the divine. Okay, so I've gone over objects of worship. Now we need to kind of talk about some of the structure of worship. So there's a couple of different categories that I've kind of worked out here. There might be a little overlap, but let's go ahead and start through them. The first one that I've written down is what I'd call a faith, which is something that's personal. So it's a religion that's undertaken at a personal level, and so it may be related to like other varieties of the religion, or there might be kind of like a branch or something like that. But it's a religion that's somebody's own. They're not just following it from a cultural or a theocratic sense, right? It's not something that's been handed down to them, like it might have been handed down to them, but it's not something that's just been handed down to them that just kind of follow because that's how things work. It's not something that they're doing from a traditional or cultural or social standpoint, but it's something that they have personally chosen, and it may or may not stand in contrast to state religions. And if it is like a state religion, it's still something that's very personal to them, it's personally chosen. This is really important because the way that people interact with their religion, if it's a personal thing, is very different than the way they're going to react and interact with it if it's just like a cultural thing, right? The level of investment is very different. It's kind of like if you go to specific movies, I don't know, say Star Wars, and you're just like, yeah, it's just a fun thing to go out into, versus if you're like hardcore into it and you like spend a lot of time researching it and thinking about it and discussing it. There's a different level of investment in sort of the fan of between like a casual fan or just like, yeah, somebody goes to see it with everybody else because everybody's going to see it, versus like, oh, I'm a fan of these things, so I want to go participate, versus like, I am reading all of the books and digging into all of the wikis and going into online discussions. Like, you can see that there's different levels of depth to fandom, from like not really a fan in the sense of like, yeah, they like it and they go see it, but whatever, it's fine either way, to I am super into this, right? So there's different levels. Religion works the same way. So that's important to think about. And then I've touched on this earlier, but the next sort of category is a philosophy or a code. So this is more of an idea of how to live, and there's lots of different possibilities here. But what it is not, at least initially, is an actual religion. However, it's very common for these sorts of things to have religious elements get grafted into them over time. That's something that's really important to consider. So an example is you may have some sort of character in the distant past who had a way, a philosophy of approaching life. How do you live? And went around teaching people of, here's how you can live better, right? And then, over time, religious elements get grafted onto that. So that's an approach to building a religion that you could take, where there's not really a lot of sort of the religious paraphernalia. There's no object of worship. Now, the person who started that may become an object of worship, but they were never seeking that. That was not a goal of theirs. Obviously, people can start religions with that as a goal. That's something else that you can consider. That's somewhat analogous to a god king in some regards, but there's that's a way that it can go. This can be useful for setting up sort of a more light sort of religious structure to people's daily lives, where maybe you don't want an overt, strong religious hand, but you still want sort of kind of a common external moral guidance system. Something like this could be really good for that. So these has some use in that regard. And then we get to the Theocratic System, which probably should be considered a little bit more often when creating settings. So a theocracy is a religion that also serves as the government, right? So a state religion is pretty much mandatory for a theocracy, and the rulers of a theocracy are usually going to be like priests, an actual deity that's maybe strongly interacting with the world, or like a god king, so a king who claims to be god or actually is a god. These are usually going to be at the head of a theocracy. There's a couple of other really important things, because secular and religious beliefs and rules will blend like all over the place. So consider having religious bents to a lot of the secular laws of the land. Like in a theocracy, state and religion are merged. There's a lot of use to this. It's a common sort of thing that you saw. God King stuff would follow this generally. And in fact, state religion, of course, is something that has been traditionally quite common. So theocracies, very common system, like I said. Let's go ahead and move on. A lot to get through here. So cultural is sort of the next category that I have for types of religion. So this is a religion that's an embedded part of the culture, right? Often people will think of themselves as being part of that religion because it's just a part of their culture. It may or may not be a state religion. If it is a state religion, there is a big difference between just a cultural state religion and a theocracy, which is the sort of way it integrates with the government. So if it's just a cultural state religion, there's a secular government. If there is a theocracy, in contrast, there is not a secular government. The government and the religious leadership are going to be the same. They're going to be blended and merged. So a secular government, if the secular government's in charge, has the authority, then that is going to be just a state religion, cultural level, but state religion might be heavily enforced and all that sort of stuff. Also keep in mind that if the religion is just cultural, it's probably going to usually be engaged at a fairly shallow level. So that's something where, imagine if everybody had to at least watch the Star Wars movies, whether or not they were a fan of it. I'm just using Star Wars as an example because it's well known. So if everybody had to at least watch them, then some people go like deep into them. Some people are like, well, I don't really like them, but you have to watch them, so whatever. That's kind of an example of how that sort of thing could play out. But most people are just not going to really think deeply about it. It's going to be something that gets passed on. Some people are going to be more hardcore, and some people are not. Again, I'm setting a lot of the framework for how this stuff gets set up. And that brings us to relational. This is similar to faith, but faith is more about how somebody reacts to the religious beliefs. Relational is about a style of religion. This is definitely going to be something that's going to tend to be more faith-based, but this is about an individual having a personal relationship with a deity or with a spirit or something like that. It may or may not have an evangelism aspect. Like all of these, something like a theocracy or a state religion is often going to be very like, you will convert to our religion. But something like this may not have that sort of evangelism of trying to win followers aspect to it. And that can be true for all sorts of things. Like a philosophy or code might be like, oh, let me recommend a way to you that's a better way to live your life, right? There can be usually some attempts to convert and stuff like that. But religions do not have to be seeking to expand like that. They could be like, hey, everybody in our area is going to be this way. If you want to come live here, you're going to have to pay attention to this, but we're not trying to like spread, if that makes sense. So anyway, relational, there's a lot of ways that you can actually use this in games that I think is particularly useful. So you can have individual deities or spirits or something that your characters form relationships with, which can provide narrative motivation, narrative guidance, things like that, where there's a relational aspect. Now, relational can be in addition to other styles. You could have a theocracy where sort of the religious head has a personal relationship with the protagonists of your game, as an example. Or this could be something where it's a much lighter touch, where maybe people kind of don't engage with religion heavily, or maybe there is a theocratic state that a different deity is now forming a personal relationship with your protagonist. There's a lot of different ways that this can go. This gives you a lot of potential sources for like miracles and things like that, relationships, all that sort of stuff. So that's something to consider. So this is kind of going over some of the structure here. There's a couple of important things to make your religion feel grounded, feel realistic, that are important to address. And one of the big ones is, how does it answer big questions? So questions such as, what is the meaning or purpose of life? Is there an afterlife? How did we get here? So when it comes to the meaning or purpose of life, this you should probably answer. Like, you should probably figure out, how does your religion answer this question, code, philosophy, whatever, that you're creating for your setting. How does it answer this question? Because this is dealing with how we live. Like, typically, this question deals with, how do we live our life here and now? Which is a question that these things are almost always seeking to answer in some way. Whether with a heavy hand or light hand, whether as guidance or as law, this is something that is typically going to be answered. There's going to be some sort of purpose statement. And then, is there an afterlife? Can be an important part of your religion, but it also may not answer this question. Philosophies and codes are not going to answer this question most of the time. But it is an important question for a lot of religions to answer, especially the question of, is there a judgment? Is there like a heaven or a paradise? Is there a hell, place of punishment? Is it just destruction? What goes on there? And really important, if there is a judgment, how does that work? What does that look like? How are things being judged? Traditionally, what a lot of people look at is a judgment that weighs good deeds and bad deeds, and whichever side of the scale comes out higher, that's the direction you go. But there can be other methods. There could just be, any bad that you've done just completely taints everything and you're gone. Or maybe you changed your life around at the end of your life. That saves you. That gets you into some sort of heaven or paradise. But this is something that's really important, because people's beliefs about afterlife stuff will guide their behavior here and now, and will have a big influence on that sort of thing. Particularly around death rituals and how people handle death and things like that. If people believe there is an afterlife, then they're going to phrase things around death differently. Now, something that's really important when it comes to games about this particular subject is that a lot of times games have some sort of resurrection mechanic. I mean, it's just not always. You might just be like, okay, reload a save, and what you're basically doing is like, we're just going to pretend that timeline that timeline doesn't need to exist. We're going to start a new one. But if you have some sort of mechanic, such as Dark Souls, you respawn at a bonfire when you die. Guild Wars 1, when you die, there's resurrection spells. There are resurrection shrines where your team will resurrect. This is important stuff to consider, especially with an afterlife. So that's all stuff you want to think about. How does afterlife interact with some of those things? And something else related to this that can be really important is, what are the interactions between the afterlife and the sort of material or physical or now world? Is there the ability to interact? So, for example, Guild Wars 1 has the ability for people to go into sort of the mists, which is where afterlife stuff takes place, or for spirits from the mists to come into the, I don't know, Tyria physical world space. So there can be some interplay there. Stuff to think about. And then a final important question that I mentioned was, how did we get here? Again, maybe it doesn't answer this, but this is a place for things like creation or origin stories, myths, that sort of stuff, which can have a lot of informing on things. Okay, next large category of things to consider when creating a religion are villains. So, are there antagonists in your religious space? An example of this could be rival deities. The other deity could be an antagonist. There could be lesser antagonists, so things like evil spirits. For example, demons is typically what they'd often get called. But these could be spirits that possess people or do other corrupty things or evil things. Something to consider. Do you have those? Are there monsters? And I should add, just as a counterpoint to antagonists, there can also be good spirits, such as angels, things that can help people combat evil spirits, stuff like that. Thinking about the whole spiritual realm may or may not be worthwhile. There's probably going to be stuff that comes up in stories. Again, like I said, monsters. In this whole vein, does the religion help protect people from evil? And if so, how? This is stuff where you can build mechanics. You can say, it empowers heroes to go and defend people against evil. Or perhaps you can have religious items that are able to protect people from evil, things like that. This can be a good source of money sinks, where perhaps you want your heroes to purchase items to help defend them against evil. Something to think about, something to consider. Okay, so that's a lot of sort of the metaphysical, structural aspect. Now we need to get into the more practical aspects of how the religion actually plays out, starting with methods of worship. So worship is kind of a complicated, nuanced topic. It gets confused because different religions have different ideas, and like Christianity, for example, Christians have a little bit of a problem of like reducing it to just singing songs or things like that. But worship in general is basically, how do people interact with their religion? How do they interact with the deity? How do they focus on it? How do they look on it to rely on it? And all sorts of stuff related to that. So probably the more important in terms of how it's going to affect your characters type stuff is going to be rituals. So this would be things like songs, holy days or holidays, chants, which is similar to songs, actions that they have to perform, rites, performances, shrines, sacrifices of like animal sacrifices, gifts of food or other sacrifices, and any articles that might be used in worship, things like tools. Maybe you have a special knife for offering sacrifices. That's an important part of it. So rituals are going to accompany or be composed of a lot of these sorts of things. So you could, for example, have, and prayer also can be an important part of some of this. Prayer is something that can kind of fit in different ways, and who can pray, and how does all that work, and who do they pray to. Prayer, keep in mind that prayer is effectively kind of like a phone call, is sort of the idea of you are calling up whatever it is that you're praying to deliver a message. That's kind of what prayer functionally is. So you can think about how maybe that would fit into your setting. Maybe a deity gets lots of prayers and is like, oh man, all these people are asking for these things or whatever. Stuff to think about. But anyway, so songs and chants can be part of your music and part of sort of the background of your game. This is something that you can use to kind of flesh stuff out. But you could also have a character that perhaps engages in songs or chants. This is something where you could use rhythm game elements, perhaps, to be able to have religious things happen. So maybe you have a system where your character can engage in these religious rituals of like some sort of singing thing that might be an important religious thing that your people do, and doing that perhaps has some benefit to your character or party or the space. You could have a game that's like, this is a character that goes around to various places in order to sing songs of purification, and you can make whole sort of rhythm game mechanics out of that or something like that. Holidays may be harder to kind of work in. Keep in mind that holidays or holy days, to not smush that together, are often like they're going to be created from something, right? Whether that's people wanting to do something with a particular mood or season or something like that, or from some sort of remembrance or some sort of big event. So harvest festivals are very common because that's a big important thing. So these might have a little bit less to do with like mechanics, but they're a part of making your religion feel more fleshed out, more whole. You may or may not want to worry about them, but actions or rites or performances, these are all kind of similar in that these are things that are done. So performances could include things like dancing or other things. Something that's really important to consider are different in terms of these things. There are different activities that people may get engaged in, such as drug-fueled orgies, were not actually uncommon, and in fact, a lot of sexual activities were part of religious worship. You may not want to include that because ratings, but that's definitely something that was done quite a lot. But there can be other performances as well. Perhaps there are theatrical performances that are done to sort of honor some sort of deity. Now, something that's really important to keep in mind with all of this stuff, with sacrifices as well. So, for example, sacrificing animals is a common thing that could be done, or gifts of food and drink and stuff like that were fairly common ways, and there would often be important religious tools. People might have little shrines to like ancestors, or I didn't even think of mentioning ancestors, but I mean, that's another thing that could be worshipped. Shrines to like little deities, ancestors, stuff like that. You can have things where that's set up. I'll talk about some of that stuff a little bit more in architectural things as well, but having some of that stuff, you can have the things where players interact. Perhaps they need to offer some stuff that, like a healing item at a shrine, could have some sort of interaction. But with all of this, all of these sorts of rituals and all these sorts of things, all of these methods of worship, consider what is being worshipped. If it is a being with will, what do they want? Why do they want it? Do they want to have a specific holiday because that's maybe they want their something commemorated? Maybe they did a particular thing then, and they want people to remember it. They want people to commemorate it. What sort of songs do they like? What sort of songs do they want? What sort of rites and rituals and all these sorts of things? What, if you have a deity with will, what do they want? Remember that all of these things are being created with purpose. All of these things are not just arbitrarily chosen. If it is a state-run religion, it's going to be created in order to help facilitate the running of the state. It's going to be used in different ways in that regard. An example of stuff that was done with animal sacrifices, or with animal sacrifices and gifts of food in the Old Testament, was that would then go to feed the priests. Like, some of it was burned, but a lot of it was a way to provide food for the priests. There was a practicality to it. Considering what the practical angle of some of these things is can be really useful. Now, there may or may not be practicality, but if there isn't practicality, consider why there's not practicality. Consider what's going on, especially if you have a real deity with real, or other spirit or something with real will. They're going to want specific things done to worship them for specific reasons. So that's something that's really important to consider. And it's really useful to consider how these might be able to be turned into mechanics. If the player needs to engage in specific activities within the game in order to be able to get benefits from the deity in some way, shape, or form, Perhaps there's actions that have been outlawed. If the player does those, all of a sudden, perhaps the deity turns against them. Or if they follow prescribed behaviors, or if they do specific rituals, perhaps that makes the deity happy. It can build a piety score that powers up access to like miracles, so things like that. We'll talk about some priesthood type stuff later that might be connected to these things. There's a lot of stuff to consider here about what is being structured, why is it being structured, and is there a way that you can pull mechanics from it of saying, okay, player, I'm going to want you to do these things, and if you do these things, here's what happens, and you can build a whole system here. But keep in mind, there can be some invalidating stuff as well. Perhaps if you do X, you can't actually get benefit from doing Y activities, right? That's something that can be important to consider. So, for example, in the Old Testament, God talks about, oh, I don't care about your sacrifices. They don't mean anything to me because your overall moral behavior is repugnant. You can't just wash that away with sacrifices and say, oh, this is going to make it all fine. But perhaps you have a deity where it does make it all fine, where it's like, oh, you've given me these things. Cool, now you're fine. I don't know. It's up to you and what you want your system to do, how you want things to interact with the player, all of that sort of stuff. A potential avenue is if the player performs these rituals and behaves in specific ways and doesn't do certain things, perhaps they get access to being able to be resurrected. But if they don't, they're out of luck. Like, that's a way that you could go about enforcing that. Maybe that's fun, maybe that's not, but it's something to consider. Okay, let's talk about some symbols here. So symbols kind of come in a couple of different sort of categories. So it can be things like what's put on graves or things like that. There can be costumes or outfits. So like, do religious leaders have a specific style of dress? Are there ornamentations that people wear? Thinking about these sorts of symbols or things like the moon and the star that is commonly used with Islam, or the cross, which is commonly used with Christianity, are a couple of symbols that I'm more familiar with. Religious symbols have significance, they have meaning, and they should not be used willy-nilly. You should think about what is the significance, what is the use of this symbol, who created them, and why. So, for example, with Christianity, the cross is kind of like, there's meaning and purpose to having it been chosen, with the idea that Jesus Christ was sacrificed on a cross. Therefore, the cross becomes sort of the symbol of sins being gotten rid of through that sacrifice. There's meaning there. It, however, is not a symbol that was chosen by some sort of religious, in terms of like, there's nothing in the Bible that says God said use the cross as a symbol. And in fact, early Christianity, as far as I understand it, used a fish symbol. So you might have seen it where it's kind of that sort of shape. I don't know how well that translated, but you've probably seen them. It still sees some amount of use. Symbols can change over time, things like that. But who chose the symbol? Why did they choose them? Is there any sort of inherent power that happens with the symbol? Are there different symbols for different things? And what is the symbology of your religion? What does it mean? And this is really important for world building. You can have stuff where you make use of it. So, for example, you could have symbols that have specific warding properties or things like that maybe you bring in that somehow interacts with the characters. You could have drawing mini games where players have to like try to draw the symbols in order to be able to have those warding effects. Just spitballing some ideas, but world building is the symbology used for your religion is really important for world building. So especially with graves and religious structures, but also just things that like people will have around. Are there symbols gracing like homes? How do people use the symbols? This is kind of what I'm saying here. Do people turn them into jewelry? Is that a thing that people do, or is it a thing people don't do? All important stuff to consider. And good use of symbols will add depth to your world. It will add believability to your world. And careless use or arbitrary use or unthoughtful use of symbols can break immersion, and it can seem like you don't care about those aspects, and perhaps it's because you don't, or it can make things seem very shallow. So an example of this in RPG Maker, there is a wooden grave that is a wooden cross. There's no reason for that other than the cross, especially my impression is that the cross in Japan is kind of a generic religious symbol. Just think about what the meanings of these symbols are and what the significance to the characters is going to be and how they came about, who created them and why. Again, is it deity with will that's created the symbol? Why is it meaningful to them? If not, like, what's going on there? What sort of religious outfits do people wear and why? What is the meaning to that? All stuff to consider. Sometimes it could just be kind of uniform when it comes to outfits. Just be like, this distinguishes somebody. Maybe then people aren't allowed to wear it unless they actually earn it and stuff like that. But stuff to think about, stuff to consider, because it does have an impact on the sense of world building and things like that. And then architecture is another important aspect of worship, or potentially can be. So an example of this, are there any styles that are important? Do religious structures have to be built in a specific way or include specific features? This is something that, again, deity with will may specify things. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe different groups have different architectural styles. How do architectural styles interact with the people's architectural styles and stuff like that? This is something that's useful to think about, but there's also a couple of other specific things. So things like altars. How are altars built? Are they made of wood? Are they made of stone? Are they made of carved stone? Are they not made of carved stone? So, again, as an example from the Old Testament, God tells the Israelites to not make the altars of carved stone. It's just supposed to be native stone, right? Just however they found it on the ground. So there's, like, altars are often an important part of religious rites and rituals. There can be where things are offered. They can be where stuff is stowed or stored, like placed on top of and things like that. But what is the style of altar and why? That's stuff that's useful to think about. And then, of course, religious statues is a really important thing. So a lot of religious worship has idols or has statues, things that people believe carries the spirit of deity in it in some way, or otherwise they direct worship towards it. This is useful. People are like corporeal visual creatures, and having some sort of visual object that they can connect to worship is, like, it's common, it's beneficial. So are there statues? If so, like, especially if, again, real deity, what is that deity's thoughts on the statues? Do they have some ability to interact with the statues? How does that work? That's something that's important to consider and to think about. How do people interact with statues? Things like that. So the other thing that's really important to consider about statues that maybe is not immediately obvious is this can be an important business. Making religious statues, like, especially if they're made out of precious metals, that was a huge business. So, for example, the New Testament makes indication that, and the Old Testament too, actually, that people like silversmiths and goldsmiths had a pretty substantial business in making idols, making religious statues. So that's something to consider as well. And is just, in general, religious ornamentation. That's a common part of architecture. So think about, again, how symbolism comes in, but other things as well. So, for example, there can be carvings and stuff like that that are based on important religious stories. That's something that's worth including as part of your world building, as part of some of that stuff. So, important to think about. Whew, we are coming close to the end here, but the next topic is religious writings. So, these are going to be really important for world building. If you have religious writings, maybe your religion has more of an oral tradition. But important stories are important because they often heavily influence language through references. People will make homages to things. I mean, it's just all sorts of stories have homages, but religion tends to be a very common foundational aspect, and so people will allude to things. Like, in our culture, we make all sorts of references to David and Goliath. This is a story from the Bible where a shepherd boy named David, who goes on to become king of Israel, kills a large person named Goliath. And this story has a lot of meaning and symbology that people derive from it about, the small overcoming the strong and all sorts of stuff. This is something that gets referenced a lot. And that's something that's important to think about for your setting of what important religious stories in these writings come up and crop up and make language homages. You're going to want to think about what sort of religious stories and myths exist in your setting. You don't necessarily need to come up with all the details. That's a lot of work. Nobody needs to write a Silmarillion in order to make a game's religion have a little bit of more depth to it and whatnot. But it's useful to think about at least the outlines of important religious stories. Things like origin stories, great acts of deities or other things, stuff that in some way becomes important, like historical elements, stories about past leaders or significant religious figures. These sorts of things are all really important to consider and to think about because they have a big impact on how people interact with things, how people relate through language, and how people think about the world and that sort of thing. So useful to think about religious stories. Other things that are important to think about when it comes to religious writings or might be useful to think about would be things like general structure. So is it predominantly narrative? Are there sayings or proverbs that are within the religious text? Are there theological or philosophical treatises? Or now I'm not sure how to pronounce that word, but basically or is there like poetry and songs? So some examples of sort of the differences between these. A lot of the Old Testament is narrative in structure. Or there could also be prophetic in structure as well, I guess. But there's a lot of narrative. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all narrative. They tell a story of what happened, right? They tell story. And then sayings and proverbs are like things that a religious leader might have said or sort of little guiding principles that people have. So the book of Proverbs in the Bible is an example of that sort of thing where you'll find little sayings and things like that. This could be something that people could use as guidance. They could also be things that get brought up as little quips and little parts of speech where the pen is mightier than the sword is an example of a saying. So stuff like that is useful to consider, how it influences language, how it influences your writing, stuff like that. And then like a theological or a philosophical writing or work, a lot of the New Testament letters, so that would be like the book of Romans, like most of the stuff after the book of Acts is an example of this. But these are things where rather than going off of a narrative or something like that, it's laying out kind of an essay on behavior and aspects of religion or theology. These could be an important part of the writings. This could be something that gets referenced. There could be specific authors that get referenced. For example, Paul is one of the New Testament writers that gets referenced quite a bit because he wrote a lot of those letters, which, again, are theological essays, basically. But you can also have like philosophical essays, particularly like a philosophies or code of conduct. Their religious writings are probably going to be this category. And then like poetry or songs, so the Psalms in the Old Testament are going to be in sort of this category, but there's a couple of other areas. This is something that could be interacted with as well. They probably have theological meaning or religious meaning in them, but they like can interact with things differently. So, for example, you could have a people whose religious writings are basically just songs that get sung, and that's how they transmit a lot of their theological meaning and stuff like that, the stories and all that sort of stuff. And then, like I said, you can have prophecy. Be careful with that. You're often setting things up. Prophecy is something that when you're creating a game world, people kind of expect you to be paying off if you include prophecy. So definitely worth considering, but being careful. And then how is it organized and referenced? Is it blended of different types? So, for example, the Bible has all of those structures that I was just mentioning. Others may not. It may be organized in some sort of chronological way. It may be organized in like chapters and verses like the Bible is. Like, how do people reference specific parts of this? So that's stuff that might be useful to consider because you can just like throw little bits out here and there. So for example, Guild Wars 1 implies that there is these religious stuff that are on the tablets of Janthier. And you can see them in the Divinity Coast mission, and you can go talk to them, and it has a little quote and implies it comes from somewhere. Or Magic the Gathering has like Songs of Sarah or whatever, and there's like little lines that will show up in flavor text and be attributed to something. This gives a cohesion to your world and can imply a greater depth than you actually have. So thinking about this sort of organizational and reference structure might actually be really useful because it allows you to be able to imply that there's a greater depth than you actually have to create. So rather than showing the depth, you can kind of imply its existence. So that's something that's useful thinking about. Another thing that's really important to actually consider related to religious texts is just how people treat them. Do they put them in a place of honor? Do they just put them on a bookshelf? Do individual people have them, or are they something that only religious leaders have access to? That sort of stuff. What sort of language were they written in? Do they get updated? How do you handle translation? That stuff can be considered. It can be thought about. I just bring it up to present the idea. But it's also just as easy to be like, this is just not worrying about that or whatever. Or how do religious writings show up on other things as well? So are there inscriptions taken from religious writings and stuff like that? This can be part of world building and that sort of stuff. Things that you can think about from some of this stuff as well is it can help mark transitions between places. If you see, that's not something I'm used to, that's clearly being attributed to some religious thing I'm not familiar with, you can use that to kind of mark stuff. But I'll get into multiple religions more later, in a different video later. Okay, priesthood. This is the next topic. So the priesthood or religious leadership is typically very important to consider. So priests serve as a sort of intermediary between normal everyday people and the divine elements of the religion. You may not always have priests. If you have a very relational style where people are interacting with, say, little nature spirits or something like that, there may not be a need for priests. Something to keep in mind. But priests are very common in religions for good reasons. So the first thing that's probably important to address about priests is, well, the first one I'm going to address anyway is who can become priests and how do they become priests. Priesthood is not always available to everyone. And the rites of becoming a priest may or may not, they can differ as well. So, for example, in the Old Testament, priests would have come from, been descendants of Aaron, who was the first high priest of the sort of Israel nation. You can read about that in Exodus if you really are interested. But his family line became priests, and the Levites, which is one of the tribes of Israel, they were generally religious leaders and had religious responsibility. Not anyone could become a priest, right? They had to be a descendant of Aaron. And they had a whole sort of, to become a head priest or whatever, they had a whole purification ritual that they had to go through in order to take on that role. So that's something that's really important to consider, is how do people become priests, what process they go through, and who can become priests. This may or may not be important to your setting, but it might be something that can be very useful to consider. You could have something where a character wants to become a priest and has to go through specific actions to be able to do that. You could build mechanics around that sort of thing. It's something that you could create. Or you could have something where, say, a character wants to impersonate a priest for some subterfuge reason. What sort of things would they have to keep in mind if they're going to do that? Would they have to particularly do stuff to disguise the fact that they don't belong to the group of people who can become priests, stuff like that. Other religions might be a lot freer on who can become priests. So, for example, Christianity does not have an explicit priest class in its in the New Testament documents. So that's because there's not a specific intermediary between man and God as established in Christianity. There's not a need for priests. Now, Christians do have priests, but I'm not going to open that can of worms here. In general, thinking about how some of that stuff works is probably going to be useful to your setting, especially if there's like miracles or other religious things involved. And that kind of brings us to the next part of priesthood, which is, are there different tiers of religious leader? For example, Catholicism will have things like the Pope and cardinals and bishops and stuff like that. Are there different tiers? How do people change roles or change tiers? What are the responsibilities of those different tiers? What are the respect levels? All that sort of stuff can be very useful to the structure of your world. May not be. Your religion may have use for that. It may not. So, for example, if it is a theocracy, then probably really important. If it is just relational, probably not going to have any priests. So, thinking about how that kind of interacts with your broader setup and what sort of costuming, garments, and all that sort of stuff, also very useful. And do they have different levels of like miracle power and all that sort of stuff? Also useful to think about. And then the next thing is, are there different religious roles? So this is different from tiers. So tiers would be hierarchical like this, right? Where this person is in charge, and then these people are under them, and so on and so forth. Versus religious roles would be things like this person specifically takes on this sort of task. So this would be kind of like monks or nuns is a different role than priest potentially. Or where you might have a role of somebody who's like a warrior versus like a religious warrior versus like a potentially like a paladin, as an example, versus like a healer or something like a cleric might be. So there can be different roles, and what are these coming from? What are the purposes? And again, with all of this priesthood stuff, if you have a deity, what does your deity want? Why? What is the structure? All that sort of stuff is really important to consider. So different roles. Again, the Old Testament has an example of different categories of Levites within their clans or whatever had different roles of different things that they're supposed to take care of. That's kind of an example of what I'm talking about. But there could also be other things of like, oh, this person's role is to attend to this aspect of the shrines, or this person's role is this other thing. This is kind of close to what sort of religious structures and services exist. So when I say structures, I'm talking not about like buildings, but about like how it's organized in terms of different fields. So you might have exorcism be a specific like trade that people go into, and might have specialists in, or like religious scribes that are responsible for recording or copying religious texts and things like that. So this might be useful to think about. These people can have a lot of power, which kind of brings me into the next category of how much power do people have? This is both from a divine standpoint as well as culturally. So, for example, a high priest might have a lot of secular power just as a religious leader. As a leader-type person, they might have a lot of power, but they might also be granted a lot of divine power. They might have a lot of ability to do miracles or things like that. So, do priests have, and like different roles within that, have different power in terms of their influence on culture? And from a divine standpoint of what they interact with. What are they able to do that ordinary people can't? Things like that. Stuff to think about. So this is where you get into some of that, like, okay, does your deity have, say, let's say you have blacksmith deity, and any old person can become a blacksmith, but you have to kind of do specific things to sort of prove yourself to the blacksmith deity, and then you can start making stuff that's imbued with that individual's power, with that deity's power, in order to make, say, enchanted stuff. So maybe that's an example of the sort of thing that you might do. Maybe you want to have a character that is a blacksmith that goes through some of those things in order to be able to make better equipment. That could be part of a crafting tree or something like that. That's an example of the sort of thing that I mean here. There is very real power in that, by becoming sort of a divine blacksmith, they're able to make enchanted stuff that is imbued with the blacksmith god's power, and that allows them to therefore exert more secular power as well, because now people want their services more than the services of an ordinary blacksmith, because they're able to make stuff that has legitimate divine power in it. So that's important stuff to consider. And then the last category that I had to talk about here is impact on culture, which is very important. So language, I've touched on this a number of times, but there's a lot in language that is influenced by religion. So idioms is an incredibly common one. This is both for allusions to stuff. So I mentioned that already, but where people talk about David and Goliath, like an homage or an allusion, versus as well as like an idiom like gospel truth as kind of absolutely true. And like, people don't necessarily have to believe these things, right? Atheists will use gospel truth to refer to, like, it's not gospel, right? Of saying, oh, that's something that's like absolutely true, that's irrefutably true. It's talking about the veracity and validity of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which I think most atheists do not believe those have veracity, right? And yet they still use that phrase. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm just saying that's how language works. And that's something that can be an important part of building your society. Another example, actually, of like religious rites or rituals kind of influencing these things, there are like Lutherans and Catholics and stuff will have sort of the phrase, God be with you, and then the callback of, and also with you. So if you go up to one of them and you say, may the force be with you, instead of responding, may the force be with you as well, or something like that, they'll often have the, and also with you, sort of rote response. This is the sort of thing of ways that religion influences the way people talk. And you can do some interesting stuff with this mechanically, where you have characters using wrong structure, where they will substitute different deities' names, perhaps, but they use the wrong structure because one religion uses a certain sort of construct for how it organizes common religious language, and another uses a different structure, and if you just do a substitution, then it's wrong. And you can have stuff like that where you can be like, oh, I am detecting that this person is a spy. Or maybe you can make a spying minigame, like, or some sort of thing where you're trying to pass yourself off as belonging to this group. If you don't copy the proper structure, you come off as wrong, or you can recognize that somebody is being wrong by doing that. So that's something that can be useful both mechanically and in world building sense. And then cussing is another aspect of language. So what are bad phrases, and how do those come about? This is often going to have a religious tinge to it. Now, there's different ways that this plays out. For example, in our culture, Jesus Christ has become, to an extent, an expletive. Not something that I think most Christians are fond of, but that is a part of the culture. And that's something that you can see there's religious influence on that. Now, how do, if that's a real deity, how do they respond? Do they say, okay, there's a judgment coming later, I'm going to deal with that sort of irreverence then? Or are they perhaps more protective, proactively, where if people kind of are misbehaving, smitings happen, and how does that influence things as well? Stuff to think about. And then, as I mentioned earlier, religious stories and myths will come up all the time as homages and all that sort of stuff. So another massive impact on culture is morality. Most religions have moralities associated with them. This is where it's useful to remember that morality is a very subjective thing. It is in the eyes of individuals to what they think is moral, what they think is right. So think about how that interacts with things. What does sort of broader religious organizations, what does culture, what do deities and spirits and whatnot say is right and wrong? How does that influence things? They do not have to align with our morals. That's really important to remember. They might. So considering how all of that works, most people care about what the morals their religion says are right are because of afterlife stuff, or things like that. Most people care about the morals of the culture that they're in because of things like prison and executions and fines. For example, speeding. There's not necessarily anything inherently moral about it, but there is a law there, and breaking that law can result in fines like that. And most people probably don't like certain speed limits. I know that there's certain roads I drive on where it's like, why is that low? But that sort of stuff, people will have their own opinions on morals and what they think is moral, but religion has stuff that it says about morality, and it can be very nuanced. This is an area where there's a lot of potential room, and thinking about the morality that deities that you have is very useful if you're wanting to create specific little things that you want your player to do, or how you want your player to behave. Perhaps you have an adventure game or like an RPG or something where opening treasure chests in people's houses gets you like negative piety, dings you on morals and stuff like that. So very useful to think about and consider potentially, depending upon what sort of systems you want to have. So finally, sort of the structural impact on culture that religion can have. So it can organize society in different ways. So things like weekly or daily rituals, things like going to church or religious services, holidays are part of this as well, can heavily impact stuff. And there can be other religiously motivated activities that people do, praying at specific times, things like that, can all be ways that the religion structures people's lives and structures society. So that's something that you might want to consider as well. Do towns always have shrines or temples or things like that? How do people express religious things? Are there pilgrimages, which is basically religious tourism of like, I'm going to go to this place for religious reasons? There can be huge industries built up around this, by the way. So just ask Israel, right? So these are all different aspects of building religion. Thinking about some of these details can help you both create a narrative in terms of how people interact with a religion. It can help you create a religion that is more unique to your game as well, which can give you it's something that can help your narrative structure and world building feel different from what's typically seen. If a lot of people are making religions and games that are basically Roman Catholicism or Shintoism, then creating something that is distinct and different can really change the way things feel. Or like, basically, I think Roman Catholicism, Greco-Roman type deities, and like Shintoism and that sort of stuff are some of the more common ways of doing religions. And so taking a different approach, doing things differently, can help the world building of your game stand out, which might be very useful. And it opens up opportunities for other types of stories to be told. It opens up opportunities for other sorts of mechanics. So you can have things where you have set up a bunch of religious rituals and rites and stuff like that, that if the player follows them, they gain piety points, and if they don't, they lose piety points. And piety, in terms of like the actions you're doing, stuff like that, can influence what sort of special powers your characters have access to. Things like that can all be stuff that's really important to consider. And there's lots of different ways that you can kind of work mechanics into this as a result of thinking about, okay, do I want the player to go through certain religious rituals and activities and other things like that in order to be able to do things? All that sort of stuff can also give you some mechanics to work with. And like I said, on the subjects of like faith and miracles and gods and stuff that I talked about last time, it's really important to consider what is being worshipped. If it's a god being worshipped, or some sort of spirit, what do they want? How are why are they doing miracles? What is their motivation? What are they trying to accomplish? Considering that sort of stuff can really help when it comes to some of that world building, in both like flavorful sense as well as mechanical sense. And figuring out how to reinforce that stuff with mechanics can really do a lot to add strength to the structure of the world, to the structure of the game, and can also potentially lead to very different play styles as well. So that's something that's also worth considering. So anyway, this has been a very long video. Hopefully there's been stuff useful to you. And next time I'm going to be talking about evolving and fracturing religions, how they change over time. So until then, everyone, take care. Goodbye.